Hello witches, and welcome back to Activist Witch, where we discuss witchcraft and activism. You can call me Isha, my pronouns are she, they. Today we're going to have a witchy chat with Briana Pegado, who is the author of Make Good Trouble, which is the book at the intersection of spirituality and activism, which, as you can guess, it's something that I have a keen interest in. Briana was so kind to answer a few of my questions, so without any further ado, let's get into this. But before we get started, let me remind you that I've opened a Ko-fi, which is an alternative to Patreon that takes less from creators and it's not fascist. And on there you can do a one-off donation, a monthly donation, or even get a tarot reading with me, Italian style. The low-income option starts at £5. And for the foreseeable future, any income that I get from tarot readings will go directly to support Coaches to Gaza, who are part of the mutual aid groups that support Palestinian people evacuated to Egypt. So if you decide to support me there, thank you so very much.
Hi, my name is Briana Pegado. I'm the author of Make Good Trouble, a practical guide to the energetics of disruption. My book is about how you can cultivate a relationship to disruption and uncertainty by leaning into that kind of energy of disruption. It talks about goddesses and archetypes that embody that energy. It gives you kind of practical tips and exercises to think about how to cultivate your kind of psychic senses. It also guides you through some tarot cards that represent different aspects of what I talk about, which is this kind of cycle of disruption. And it's influenced by my experience as an artist, as an author, working in the creative industries and working in activist spaces, from the student movement to anti-racism movements to the climate crisis and all sorts. So that's me. I try in a nutshell. There's a lot more, but we can talk about that in our conversation.
So much more. Premise. I am dyslexic and I very rarely can actually read. So I go on audiobooks or stuff like that. When I saw that your book was out, I begged your publisher to listen. I'll find a way. And it took me like 2.5 months to read. But every time I was turning a page, I was like, oh my goodness, there's someone, I'm not alone. It was such a beautiful experience to go through. So thank you for writing
I'm so
that.
honored. It's my pleasure.
If I'm not wrong, you wrote a chapter in a collection before that was sort of like about sort of spiritual witchiness and activism. What was that? Sorry, this wasn't in the question, but I was curious.
Of course. So I contributed a chapter to The Modern Craft, Powerful Voices on Witchcraft Ethics. That was edited by Alice Tarbuck and Claire Askew. And actually, Alice and Claire both lived at the time in Edinburgh. Claire has since moved to Northumberland, I believe. And I knew both of them kind of through esoteric spaces, literature spaces, the arts. And essentially what happened is during the pandemic, I started posting more regularly in my stories about my altars, about moon days, about different wheels of the points in the wheels of the year, about my kind of own practice. And I actually engaged in something called 100 Days Project Scotland, which is on now, which is this challenge to do something creative every day for 100 days. And I essentially posted a poem unedited on my stories every day. And though, you know, in terms of kind of neurodivergence, I was just diagnosed with autism and ADHD in February. I always suspected I was neurospicy. So that resonates deeply with what you were saying around, obviously it's not the same as dyslexia, but kind of having those experiences of neurodivergence. And essentially, I often, from the ADHD side of things as well, like small details, directions, instructions just kind of go over my head sometimes. So even when I was writing these poems, I'd read them back and go, oh my gosh, so many typos. But Claire really loved the poems. She actually asked me to perform as part of Listening Softly, a poetry night at my favorite bookstore, Golden Hair Books in Stockbridge in Edinburgh. And then essentially, a few months later, she approached me and asked me if I wanted to contribute a chapter to this anthology. And I thought, who, me? And she said, yeah. I'd love you to write about your practice. So the chapter is all about energy and healing and kind of the ethics of healing other people or doing energy work when you also need to take responsibility for your own kind of trauma and healing needs. And the last thing I'll say about it is my theta energy healing teacher, master, Jennifer Main, who's also based in Edinburgh, she would always say, you have to heal your own stuff. So my chapter is about healing your own stuff, your own trauma, your own energetic debris, even though I'm not sure if I like that term. So yes, that was the chapter I contributed, which led the publisher that published The Modern Craft to getting in touch with me on Ostara in 2021, and they said, would you like, the subject line was another book project, question mark. And I thought to myself, what is happening? And the publisher just said, would you like to write a book? You can write it about whatever you like. We loved your chapter in the modern craft. And my chapter was Lucky 13 as well, which I think is significant. And they asked me to write this book that we're talking about, which I have here. Make your trouble.
Oh gosh, I haven't taken close to me. It was so peculiar because I looked at like the stuff.
Thank you, floating hand.
I have flying hands around that help. It's like my little elf.
Love it.
Honestly,
I also love manicure because it matches the book. How wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so dog-eared. It's all dog-eared. Like seriously. Right. Actually, we should get into this then. Yeah. I am very partial and very biased about this because before this, I thought that I was the only one that brought those two sides together. I am an activist IRL. I'm part of like grassroots organizations here in Cardiff, in Wales. And I started practice a couple of years ago, but I realized that I was very hesitant about sharing that part of my life. And then in the last 6-8 months, like I opened a YouTube channel and still I was like, oh, it's interesting. Like I hear people talk about, I don't know, the maiden mother crone archetype, and I can explain like benevolent sexism through it. I hear people talking about Harry Potter, and I can explain to them why we do not endorse J.K. Rowling. Like it was all these things, and I was like, that I can justify. But my first question was literally about how did you manage to bring together your activism and talking about energy or metaphors of energy? Because I know that in my case, I had the concern about, are they not going to take me seriously because I talk about these? And I'm genuinely asking because I could use some tips.
Of course. Oh, my pleasure. Well, the first thing I should say is I have no answers. I can share my experience of it. And there's so much about this because I think depending on who you're speaking to in the kind of energy world, esoteric world, health and wellness space, however you want to talk about these concentric circles, people talk so much about our wounding, whether or not it's Chiron and the wounded healer and this whole idea of, you know, that kind of archetype and also kind of astrological, cosmic archetype of Chiron, this, comet and this wounded healer who was healing others, but had this wound that they couldn't heal themselves. And I think that, people sometimes talk about, when you kind of heal your inner child wound or you heal this wound or that, you won't be so worried about these two different things kind of not kind of integrating or coming together. And I think that kind of language and talking about things is not very helpful because I think, as we both know, healing is not a destination. It's a lifelong journey. We have these kind of constant cycles of things coming back in our life to kind of show us something different or a new lesson. And I don't know if I love the word lesson either, but showing us something new about ourselves. And it's something I still really find I compartmentalize. So yes, I'm constantly thinking, there's this part of me that's creative and artistic. Even with my own art practice, I've spent my entire working life as a producer, running festivals, supporting other artists, and always feeling like I'm constantly not making enough time for my own practice. And then you start to get this distance from it and you think, am I an artist? Can I make creative things? I kind of support people that have this big career. When it comes to the activism, and it comes up in the book a little bit, as you know, as well, I've always been a person, and I've started to think about this in terms of values. It's like what I believe in, my beliefs, my values are really clear, are really prominent. I have a really strong sense of things when there's a sense of injustice around things. And I'm really easily able to kind of speak up for others. I think advocating for myself has become a practice and something that's taken me more time. But I think for me, from the very early stages, I had family members, particularly my mom, who was in politics. And there's something here around my kind of struggles or challenges with these two parts of myself, the activist side and kind of my own kind of witchy healing practice, because my mother, was a Black woman in politics in the 80s in the United States of America and in like public relations. And it's something that I know we'll talk about later, but she always told me from this place of fear, from this place of self-preservation, from this place of lived experience of like, don't burn your bridges. It's almost like, don't be too disruptive. Don't be too loud. Don't draw too much attention to yourself, and that comes from the trauma of, Black people in the States and slavery. It comes from the trauma of being a minoritized person in a kind of world that is completely the opposite of her lived experience, who she was. It comes from white supremacist systems, from colonialism, from patriarchy, all these things. And it's so interesting. I internalize that so much. So there's a part of me that's always a bit like, well, I have to say something about this. This is so wrong and unjust. But also there's this part of my brain that's constantly ruminating around don't burn bridges. And I kind of have reconciled all of that. But I think what's happened is, by nature of being in Scotland during a pandemic, during the independence referendum vote, during Brexit, being a student at a time when the Liberal Democrats in the UK, as we know, kind of made all these promises about higher education, and then fees came into place in 2010. I was at university at a time that my university was celebrating Black History Month for the first time. So I think the short answer to your question is, it's been unavoidable. So it's almost like, in some ways, I've chosen to kind of be in these political spaces or get involved in the student movement and student politics. And my first job after the student movement as a sabbatical officer was with a feminist organization. So I've always been involved in these spaces, but it hasn't always been easy and it hasn't always been reconcilable. And I think what's helped me is, as we're seeing, and you're talking about your podcast starting 6 to 8 months ago, over the last 5 to 6 years, maybe obviously a bit longer, there's been a real increase in people turning to tarot, turning to witchcraft, turning to earth practices. That, of course, has always been there. We've had long kind of histories and traditions of this, but this kind of distrust in the status quo and institutions and people holding power in kind of organized religion to some extent, obviously not everywhere in the world, but like largely in the Western world and the global North. That, I think, has made it easier, because this kind of integration of spiritual practices and activism and kind of my working life and my private life, or my working life and my spiritual life, has kind of all come together. But I think the timing has just been right. And writing the book was part of that process of kind of trying to integrate these things too.
I have been raving about your book to all my IRL groups. I'm part of Glitter Council, which is the organization for queer people of color here in Wales. I was part of Trans Pride Cardiff here. And to everybody, I was like, you don't know. Because every time that I have a tarot deck with me, everybody's a bit curious. But if you ask them, now, of course, they don't know, they don't do. So on that great curiosity, and the fact that your book literally brings together what we do every day with, there are ways to look at these in a, you start off with the gateway drug that it is tarot, and then so it was such an amazing discovery for me when I saw the cover and I saw the title, and I didn't know what it was going to be about, but I was like, this inspires me. This is something that I would definitely take the chance of reading. And then it got to me, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is the most serendipitous thing that has ever happened.
Yay! Oh, wonderful.
Going a bit on the part of the practice, then I love that every chapter has its exercises on how, okay, this is what is happening, this is how you disrupt, this is how you take care of yourself. So would you feel like sharing a bit about, I don't know if you have a daily practice, a daily spiritual practice, what is that side of you?
Great question. And it's funny, I was speaking to a healer friend who's a doula, and they're queer as well. And we were kind of having this conversation about disruptions in our lives. And because I've gone through my ADHD diagnosis in February and was really experiencing some quite intense increase in sensory overload and all sorts of things, my daily practice has shifted. And it's so interesting. It's like, how do we give ourselves permission as well to allow our practice to ebb and flow? So up until probably the middle of or beginning of last year, because I had so much illness last year, which I think had some spiritual roots, which I'll talk about, I would always have monthly altars. I would kind of change them for either new zodiac seasons or kind of the full and new moon. What I do keep up is kind of like a weekly ritual of, there's an astrology podcast I listen to. So I listen to it mostly. Hello, kitten. Hello, kitten. And so basically, my weekly kind of ritual is listening to this astrology podcast, my forecast for the week, thinking about what are the themes emerging for that week, how it's impacting me. I live by the sea, so just kind of being able to open my window, because I'm really pretty much right next to the sea. Ridiculous, I know. I open my window, I kind of hear the waves, and Sunday night or Monday morning, I kind of start with that kind of forecast for the week. I also take a lot of either, salt baths or kind of ritual baths. So I try to do that kind of weekly, but sometimes it's about once a month. And my practice around my altar has really shifted, especially because we rescued a kitten and she knocks off all the crystals all the time. So what I tend to do is I will set intentions for the month. I'll collect flowers that our cat can be around for kind of the monthly kind of shifts and seasons. But I think what I've really started to do is, instead of having that private practice, which is at home, which is the altar, which is doing rituals, which is setting intentions on my own, I try to gather with a group of other witches and kind of healers and witchy folk, and we celebrate kind of the different wheels of the year. Obviously, we have Litha coming up, and we have the solstice. So that has kind of been this is what I almost call low energy practice, because all of these health changes, these moves, writing this book was a massive energetic, I won't say spend, because I don't see this as a deficit of you spend energy and you collect it. No, but writing this book was quite a big, energetically huge, large, I won't say taxing process. And so I've realized that I'm still kind of recovering from that. So yeah, it's about kind of honoring things in community when I can, or just resting, trying to take solstice days off, trying to take kind of quarter days off, trying to take full moon days off. So I've really tried to get into the practice this upcoming week of having no work scheduled on Friday for a full moon. And that's what I tend to do: baths, rest, days off, and where I can kind of celebrating in community. This kind of capitalist, system we live in, constant need for productivity, and also that intersection of capitalism and neurodivergence or disability. And yes, when I started my healing journey, which was, 15, 16 years ago, when I started going to therapy in my 30s, so as a teenager, and there were reasons for that. I started in my early 20s to get quite hyper fixated. I know now what it was. And I mean, I've always had anxiety. I've always had a bit of depression, but in this new framework of my neurodivergence and understanding it more, yes, I would do maybe not the exact same, but similar things of, oh, I missed a day, or, oh, I didn't listen to the podcast on Sunday, so I better listen to it tomorrow, or, oh, I forgot to kind of do the ritual on the full moon day. And with my healing journey, it's that fine line of, I'm so interested in healing and psychology, in different healing practices, modalities. My Instagram is full of people that I follow who are psychologists, who are healers, who are astrologers, readers. And it was so easy for me to just constantly consume all of this information and kind of want to get better, in air quotes, want to improve. And I'm continuing this journey. It's not easy. I'm having to kind of let go and not hold myself to such a high standard and so tightly. But this comes back to what you're saying as well about being a kind of good with your spiritual practice. It's like being a good feminist, being a good anti-racist, being a good queer activist. And I think, as we know, that's all so intrinsically linked and wrapped up in capitalism and the capitalist systems we survive through. I'm not even going to say live in, survive through.
Oh, yeah. How do you think you can manage to find the balance basically between those two things? There's a point about disrupting and going and not stopping until something is done. But there's also the part of how do you then basically retreat in a way and retreat inwards, and I'm like, okay, there's only so much I can do about this because it's sucking me dry. So what do you think could be a functional compromise, I guess, between speaking up and warning others and telling the community, but also disengaging and not necessarily be hurt directly from these things?
Yeah, I mean, we could spend this entire podcast for another week talking about this, because there's so much to consider. And I think this is such a beautiful question, because I have definitely been a person throughout my life who becomes physically so impacted by holding things in. And so this whole concept of gray rocking, and for anyone listening, It's this notion of if you're engaging with a toxic system, it doesn't have to be an individual person or a group of people who are gaslighting you, manipulating you. And I know you would have heard this from all of your wonderful content as well. The best solution, because their intentions around their manipulation, particularly if we were talking about narcissistic systems, selfish systems, or narcissistic people and selfish people. And again, I say these words with a lot of levity, because there are people that genuinely have narcissistic personality disorder, and I'm not blaming them. These are things they can't necessarily control, and there are people with narcissistic traits. Then we're also talking about selfishness. There are different gradients of this, different scales. And then when we're talking about systems, we're talking about extractive, exploitative systems. But essentially, if you're in a situation where your reality is literally being denied, you're being ignored, you're being undermined, you're being manipulated, what can you do? Because there's a power dynamic there. And I spent all of my life thinking about power and power dynamics. And gray rocking is this method that was coined by, I don't know exactly which psychologist, but is this whole notion of acting like a gray rock, impenetrable, giving people very little information, non-committal responses, not engaging with their comments, with their questions, with their trying to lure you in. It's literally giving them very little, or the situation very little, so that you can almost neutralize it. There's nothing that they can manipulate in you if you're not giving them personal information or responding, and you're just trying to placate to an extent. I don't think it's that passive, but you're kind of protecting yourself. And I think back to your question, I've been in so many situations where I have whistleblown or kind of called things out, either in a company or an organization. I've mostly worked in the cultural sector, so this hasn't been in private spaces. This has been in organizations with a social cause, or communities or activist spaces, or cultural organizations and sectors. A few things have happened. I've either discovered an abuse of power, literally abusers in an organization, or a kind of financial mismanagement or something that's going wrong. And I've noticed it, and it sometimes takes me months. I'm noticing this, I'm feeling it energetically, something feels off, I feel heavy, I feel controlled, and I choose to speak out. And at times it's been on my own or with someone else I'm working with, or you start to speak to people about it, and it turns out there's a whole group of people or community of people being impacted by this, not to mention these incredibly problematic systems and structures in these organizations that reflect wider society. And I think when we're talking about activist communities and spaces for causes, fighting for our kind of trans siblings' rights, or fighting for kind of the climate crisis, these are things that are so massive that there's this real question of how much energy do you have to give? And I think this compromise comes in where, yes, you should speak up. Yes, you should speak out. But the question is kind of trying to assess, and you won't know until it starts to happen, until you start to speak out. Are people going to support you? Is this actually a safe environment for you to be doing this in? And I know that's a strange word to use, because to an extent, it's never safe. You're disrupting harmful, toxic, problematic systems. But where it's negatively impacting your mental health, where you're not seeing solidarity and support, that's where I think it's not even about self-protection. It's kind of this preservation thing of, okay, I always see activism, and I know this isn't my quote, as a marathon, not a sprint. And from that not a marathon, a relay race, not a sprint. So can you hand the baton off to someone else for a little while? 6 months, a year? Do you need to take a step back from that cause, from that organization, from that group of friends, even from that community? And I know that we can't live in isolation and always retreat, but I think the tarot shows us these beautiful kind of examples of this. So does astrology. So do all of these kind of quotes about the natural world. We know flowers don't bloom all year round. We know certain mammals hibernate. So it's that real thing of, yes, actually, it's part of a natural cycle. And I don't know if I even like the term natural. It's part of our need to kind of retreat and take some pause. But I also think those of us that are vocal, that are activists, that know how to make change, that know how to organize, that know how to come together in community, that know how to hold people to account, are very good at what we do. And quite quickly, back to capitalism, back to productivity, back to what's expected of us. A lot can be put on us if we're good at showing up and doing the work. And it's that thing of people will always ask us for more because we're in this environment of extraction. So it's like, okay, they mean well. They're not doing it for bad reasons, but actually knowing your own boundaries and your own limits. And that will change at different points in our life. What's going on in our life? how we are in terms of our health, what's happening in our community and in our families, our chosen families, and our energy levels shift. So when I was in my 20s, I could just keep going until I burnt out. I kept going. I kept being like, no, I can't sit down. Or I would be disruptive in spaces that I thought were community. And actually, turns out people in charge and in power didn't like it. I mean, the amounts of times I've been in Black queer spaces where people are not paid properly. If it's a cultural organization, people are being exploited. And I've stepped back and gone, I don't want to be part of this. I don't agree with this. And the people running it have gone, you what? Okay, you're out. We don't like you. Bridge burn. We don't trust you. And kind of putting that blame on me when actually they're not doing ethical, good practices or good things. So that's my long-winded way of saying assess where you are in your life. And remember, you're allowed to take a break. I think sometimes that internalized guilt of like, I'm not doing enough. I need to be consistent. I need to keep up the energy. That's true. But like, you also need to, be healthy to an extent or be well. Let's not talk about health. You need to be well. You need to kind of have some endurance. And also, you're allowed to take a break forever. You could wake up one morning and go, I'm finished with this now. I've done all I can for the time being. And we know that activism looks like different things. It could be writing a book. It could be cooking and supporting your community. It could be doing your own learning. It doesn't have to be on the front lines all the time. But I also say this with knowing there's a massive privilege as well to having that choice, because not all of us have that choice. And it's that question of, if you have the privilege of not being so visible in these different spaces, how can you be a good ally and support while also thinking about the longevity?
I kept thinking, no, the moment that you get to a group of your people, kindred spirits, or like people that have gone through your struggle, we will look out for each other because the system is already rigged against us. And I didn't have the awareness or understanding to see, well, because we have been hurt so much from the system, there is a lot of healing that we need to do within the community. And it might happen that we kick out against each other because we have all that trauma, generational trauma. And I was really naive about that. I was really naive.
Oh, human. And also naive, or you could say hopeful. You would hope all those things that you said, that, there wouldn't be all of that internalized trauma, internalized homophobia, internalized kind of experiences of oppression. But yeah, and people say this, skin folk always aren't kinfolk, aren't always kinfolk. And that phrase, can be problematic in a lot of ways. But yeah, that sense of not everyone has that consciousness around their queerness or being a person of color or being, of a different kind of gender identity group, different genders. And so, yeah, like they might be still holding tight to their proximity to heteronormativity, to being straight, to being white, all those things. And we understand why, but it's really awful when you're on the receiving end of that and experience that. And I've been at different places in my own journey. I mean, growing up in the States, in Washington, D.C., it's like I had so much internalized belief systems around capitalism, around so many things. And my awareness of being Black and being a person of color, my parents instilled that in me. But I don't think, especially in the last kind of 10 years, I don't think I really had a political awareness fully of all of this until I had my own lived experiences, especially living in Europe, living in the UK. It's a journey. It takes time, but you're so right about that need for healing within communities. And also that sense that we know a community isn't homogenous. All different types of people are in that space, which is the beauty of it, but also means from a kind of political perspective or from a kind of self-awareness perspective or an anti-oppression perspective that is not always there.
Yeah. Growing up in the US brings me very natural to the next question. This year is going to be election year, both here and in the US. It's what advice would you have for all good disruptors out there, especially considering all the methods of voter suppression that are directly aimed at marginalized communities?
So my advice, and people can take this with a pinch of salt if they like, is to continue to engage in our political system while you're trying to disrupt it, because it's this whole question, right, of tactics. Do you want to dismantle and disrupt and therefore not bother with the current system as it exists? Would you rather work slowly and steadily, even though I know we're running out of time? We think about things like the climate crisis, so many other things. Time is not on our side necessarily. But I think that actually we have the power collectively to kind of influence, not completely change, that will take dismantling, but influence the existing political system and the existing kind of political environment. And it's a bit like, and I'm speaking from a very biased perspective. I grew up in a family that was very involved in politics. I got involved in student politics when I came to the UK. I've always voted, and I haven't always had a right to vote because I'm a migrant. So I don't take things lightly, but I can also understand why so many people are disengaged, feel apathetic, not even apathetic, angry, don't want to kind of engage with the system at all. I completely understand that. I completely respect that. That's your choice. And my argument would be, if you don't engage, think of how much worse it's going to be. It's like giving up that opportunity to at least make things more manageable. I'm not saying we aren't living in a time of incredibly conservative far-right policies, of economic, crisis. I'm not saying all of that's true. And I can see why someone would look at the options for the UK election and think, well, they're all just different options in the spectrum of the same. There's nothing that's genuinely transformative or radical here. Yes, that is true. However, don't you want the least worst option in politics? And for the time being, while we're also working to dismantle the system. And I think, people talk about revolution and dismantling things quickly. I believe in kind of things being sustainable. There's going to be a transition period. There's going to have to be unpicking things. It's not going to go change overnight. And actually, yes, it could. We've seen like examples in history of revolutions and things happening overnight. But is that actually going to be healthy? When we talk about trauma, we talk about violence, when we talk about like building a world that is abundant, that is collaborative, that is equitable, that is allowing everyone to thrive and people that have been oppressed to thrive. I actually think we need to think about what that process is going to be of transition. And, some people might listen to this and think that sounds very conservative or that doesn't sound very radical. I think we need to be radical, but I think disengaging from the system entirely means we're letting people with greed, with profit and, at the core of things, who care about money, who care about exploitation, who care about kind of, continuing to create further inequalities, who continue to oppress. We're allowing them to continue to do all of these awful things. And we're not actually using our civic, power, our voting power to protect those most marginalized. And I think actually back to privilege and back to kind of what power you do have and what is in your realm of control and responsibility, because some things are out of our control. Some things are out of our kind of scope of responsibility. It's like, what can we do? And so I believe we should use our vote and we should do something, particularly because not everyone has the right to vote. Think about people who have been incarcerated. Think about people who are refugees, who are migrants. It's just like, could you vote for them? And what would you vote if you could vote for them while we're also dismantling this system, this abusive system?
Right. So we can sort of wrap this up. And again, because your book sits perfectly, from what I've seen, at the edge between spirituality and activism, which again, it's my bias, but I adore. If you were to advise a witchy or spiritual book to an activist that just does like activism involved with that, to start to approach the spiritual or witchy side, what would that book be? And or podcast or anything else? And what? Ooh, hello, we already are here.
So this is Alice Tarbuck's A Spell in the Wilds, and this is one of the authors that edited The Modern Craft. So the subtitle is A Year in 6 Centuries of Magic. And I did the very neurodivergent thing of reading a chapter a month. So she writes a chapter for each month of the year. Yes. And she's an activist. She's very intersectional. She's very self-aware. So for example, September's on foraging. So she has a spell or ritual at the end of each chapter. And then each chapter is kind of set around the wheel of the year. But what's really interesting is because it's a year and 6 centuries of magic, she goes into kind of the history around different practices. And there's a chapter on ruins where she actually talks about the kind of neo-Nazi, deeply problematic aspects of ruins. and how ruins obviously have this like beautiful history and beautiful tradition that should be respected, but how ruins have also been co-opted by far right groups, particularly kind of purist groups that are kind of in heavy metal spaces. And I love heavy metal spaces, but that are really promoting kind of white supremacist, like neo-Nazi beliefs. Yeah. So my point is that I think this is a perfect book because it's kind of guided by rituals and magic and spellcraft and Wheels of the Year, but also really beautifully weaves in kind of really important historical context and information and stories about kind of witchcraft trials. So it's deeply feminist, it's deeply intersectional, it's deeply anti-racist, and it's deeply eco-conscious because she's a kind of ecologist as well. She didn't study ecology, but that's deeply part of her spiritual practice, as many of us. So yeah, highly recommend this. This came out, I think, like 2 years ago, and you can order it anywhere you like. So yeah, that's Alice Tarbuck.
I will put links down below. I will get a copy myself because I didn't know about this one.
It's beautiful. It's so beautiful. And I finished it like only last September. So I read it literally, and it was really nice to just, as part of my monthly ritual, I'd read the chapter and kind of, and you know, she's neurodivergent. She has chronic illness. So it's very informed by those lived experiences as well. So yeah, it's beautiful.
I'll ask you the last question, which is sort of the other way around of the previous one. So that was a book to introduce witchiness to activists. What would be the other way around? So someone that is spiritual and interested and maybe is like, oh, maybe I should do something, but they don't know. They don't know where to start.
Sorry, I haven't read this yet. So this is the caveat, but I know this person. This is Mikaela Loach, who's a Black climate activist. She is based in London. She went to Edinburgh Uni. I met her during COP26 in Glasgow, and her book, It's Not That Radical, which you might have already known about, came out last year, but the hard copy came out last year. The soft cover came out a few months ago. And I know that she's Christian and she kind of has some spiritual practices. So it's like a slightly different type of spirituality. And I know that with a lot of people, like Christianity or organized and traditional Abrahamic religions can be a point of soreness. So I'm just asking people to kind of like be open to it. But she's an incredible climate activist, and her book's called It's Not That Radical. And it's all about kind of climate action to transform our world. And the book, and I'm saying this and doing a terrible job promoting it because I've literally not read it yet because it's been on my list forever. But, you know, she's got chapters from what is climate justice, who's responsible, beyond white environmentalism, deconstructing capitalism, in denial, too radical or not radical enough. That's not the type of diversity we want. So yeah, she's a Black queer activist and she's incredible and her content's brilliant. This is a person who has called a lot of people out. So she, for example, the Edinburgh International Book Festival last summer, Greta Thunberg decided to boycott it because it was funded by Baillie Gifford, which is a kind of asset management firm in Edinburgh that funds fossil fuels. It's also been tied to a lot of kind of Israeli IDF funded settlements and funding. And essentially, she decided to have her book event, but she staged a walkout halfway through it and helped kind of start the Fossil Free Books campaign, which has been running for a year, which has had a lot of success. So she's a person that really...
as well. We have the Hay Festival.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was lovely to see.
So I recommend her for someone who's already kind of attuned to their spiritual practice and witchiness.
It's amazing that book is mainly starts off from an environment point of view, because I think it's literally the one point where most of the pagan community can start to grow their empathy. So thank you. That is amazing.
Completely. And I think when especially when you're talking about paganism, and so it's so interesting when we talk about Indigenous people, it's like, who's Indigenous? Because like, obviously, people from the global south, global north, brown people are Indigenous, they're Indigenous traditions, tribes, communities. I'm part of the Halawa tribe, though I've not had any direct ties to mine. My great grandmother, who was alive until I was 16, went to powwows, and my uncle identifies as Halawa, not Black. And so what I'm getting at is when it comes to paganism and it comes to thinking about Wales and Scotland in particular, all these Indigenous communities that have been here for centuries, that have so many traditions around language, around rituals, around practice. I think all Indigenous communities of different kind of types have that deep tie to the earth and have that deep reverence and respect for the earth. And there is so much we can learn. And as you said, that's something that is deeply held and believed in kind of pagan circles and communities, in Gaelic, traditionally Gaelic circles and communities. And I know I'm talking about Gaelic as a language, but also as a kind of ethnic grouping. An identity. And so I think you're right. I think that's like a really important point of solidarity and commonality and reverence. And that righteous anger is just, I mean, that's what this book is about as well. Originally, the book was going to be about the goddess Kali, and I'm not Indian or Hindu, and my best friend is, and I used to go to temple with her. But in the process of writing the first chapter for that book, I was speaking to my editor, and we both kind of said, this doesn't sit right. This isn't my tradition. This isn't my culture. So Kali can come into one chapter, but about something a lot wider. But yeah, I think you're right about that kind of entry point in terms of solidarity and support. And I know I use the word solidarity a lot. You know, we're also living in a society of individualism. And I think from a neurodivergent perspective, especially with my autism and ADHD, I've spent so much time in the last year and a half not seeing people because I've been writing a book and I've been going through this process of unmasking and understanding my neurodivergence and not having as much energy. And so, yeah, it's that question of where do we find community? We're always part of it. We literally live in an ecosystem and we're mammals and we're part of it. But yeah, where can we make those choices to kind of come together and explore things with different communities? I think is so important. And I think that point about paganism is so true.
I'll happily go and knock at the door of the Waterstones that we have here. I'm sure that also like, why not? Why not?
That would be amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, your generosity, your vulnerability. And yeah, I'm just so grateful. So thank you.
No, thank you for spending. I can't imagine the time and attention and effort and energy that this took. But it's a beautiful gift that you're living in the world. So thank you for this so much. I will put all your links down in the description below. I don't think I need to say anything else than like go check out the amazing work and gift that Briana gives us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, wasn't that something? You find all the links to reach out to Briana and read her stuff down in the description below. And until the next video, I really hope that we can hex the patriarchy together, because there's need for it.